I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from first-time guest, anthropologist Ida Susser, author of the new book, The Yellow Vests and the Battle for Democracy, Taking to the Streets of Paris in the 21st Century. In this conversation, we'll be talking all about the Yellow Vests movement, a very controversial movement of protest in France. And we'll be separating the reality from the fiction, the sensational from the real, and much more. You're not going to want to miss this episode. But before we get to that, I'd like to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener-funded with the exception of my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you sign up, you'll be able to hear the Parallax vlog with yours truly and C. Derek Varn. We release a fun episode on a variety of different topics each month. We often talk about movies as well as current events, and I believe the next episode we'll be talking about Fight Club, which just got a 4K release. So we're going to be revisiting that David Fincher movie. Check it out at patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, if you can, visit the website of my sponsor, Mike Swanson, at wallstreetwindow.com, the best financial and trading newsletter out there. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation with Ida Susser on the Yellow Vests and the Battle for Democracy. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very happy to have on. Ida Susser is the author of a new book, The Yellow Vests and the Battle for Democracy. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. And the book is open access, free online. I just want everyone to know that because it was a lot of effort to do that. And I thought the topic was so about the commons, about the public, and I wanted it to be free.
Now, before we delve into the book itself, maybe you can talk a little bit about yourself, and then we can talk about how you discovered the Yellow Vests and why you wanted to write a book on them. And also, if I have listeners here in the U.S. that are unfamiliar with the Yellow Vests, maybe we should explain that.
Okay, well, I've always been interested in political movements, changing the world. I think I was brought up that way, and I became an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, in order to try and understand the world and how things get changed. It wasn't that I was so interested in specific aspects, like whatever you might imagine anthropology is. But to me, as I was going through understanding scholarship, I could see that anthropology was a method, a way to get to know people and talk to people, and with some theoretical way to understand what was happening when you were able to be on the ground with people and not only larger abstract. I believe in counting, I believe in quantitative, but for me, I wanted to see beyond that, and that's why, and I wanted to understand social change.
Now, again, for my listeners that may not be familiar, who wore the Yellow Vests? What was the Yellow Vests movement, if I have listeners that are unfamiliar?
Okay, so I had started studying different kind of social movements, especially more recently around what we called Occupy Wall Street, and what in France they had something called Nuit debout, which was very similar, saw itself as part of the sort of Occupy Wall Street, although it came a few years later. And I was already wanting to understand the kind of social movements that you get in the moment that we're in, global cities, global capitalism. How do local people the grassroots, change anything when we're all about, the the different arrangements at the global level, the UN, the wars, whatever. What do people on the ground do? And that, how can they change what they're being subjected to, or how do they change their societies? So I was already studying movements in Barcelona and Paris when I heard about the Yellow Vests. I was already going back and forth to France. And what I heard and how they began was that sometime in the spring of 2018, Macron, the president, decided to put a tax on diesel. And there had been tax on all the other gases, as you probably know, here not much, but in Europe much. And people were outraged because diesel had not had a tax. It was the cheapest gas. And working people bought the cheapest cars, which took diesel because they didn't have a lot of money and it wasn't taxed. It was like they had been steered into it by government policy. And they were like outraged. And all of the transportation, like the trains and the public buses, had been reduced over the last decades. They'd all been cut back. Train lines had been abandoned all over Europe as little ones that go to local villages. And here they were, reliant on their cars, taking their kids to school, going to the doctor. Nothing in the village. It doesn't even sell bread anymore. No, hardly a post office. Everything that you do as a mother or as a worker is in a car. And you don't have a lot of money to get to the end of the month. And suddenly they put this tax on the kind of car and the kind of gas that you specially chose because they had left it to the poor. So it was an outrage. So there was an email from a woman she lived on the suburbs of Paris saying, let's start something on email. And then truck drivers suggested that you put the yellow vests are required by French law in every single car in France. They're those things that construction workers, bright yellow, you can run in them. They don't run you over. So everyone in Paris, in France, all through France, had to have one in their car. And the truckers and the women driving their kids to school and nurses going to work started putting yellow vests in their window. And then they started meeting on the corners of their streets in it was called rond-point, roundabouts, traffic circles in America. And in those traffic circles, people met and they exchanged how shocked they were and their problems with money. And they started, well, what are we doing here? And the whole idea got bigger and bigger. It wasn't just about diesel. And suddenly, by November 17th, that was the historic moment, 300,000 people ran into Paris, breaking windows, turning over cars, setting motorbikes on fire, rushing up to the Arc de Triomphe in absolute rage at this diesel tax and also the cost of living and also the cutbacks in every kind of service that had been taking place. And the more they met, the angrier they got. And it was a very, very grassroots movement.
This book could have covered any number of different protests. We've seen books on Occupy. We've seen books on May 1968 in France. Why this specific intervention with yellow vests? Go on.
Yeah, I was studying the social movements in global cities. I wasn't particularly focusing. I had put it in a context going back to practically the French Revolution, but certainly back to the Paris Commune and all the things that Americans don't know. There were street uprisings every decade in France in the 19th century. So I was putting it in that context. But then the yellow vests were extraordinary. Nobody in Paris understood them. Nobody in France understood them. Everybody, they were like a mystery where people in those demonstrations many of them had never been to Paris.
Are you saying there's something different or unique about the yellow vests?
There was something very, very unique about and people in France found them very, very unique. Yes. Really surprising, and people were frightened and they were shocked. And they were not sure, was this a right-wing uprising? Was it coming to like knock down all the rich people in Paris? But was it a right-wing uprising, or was it going to be more inclusive? I see it as left-wing if it's calling for everybody to get help, to build the healthcare system back up, to build the transportation system back up. And this, nobody knew. There was lectures by social scientists like, is this from the right or is this from the left? And basically, people had no idea, no ideology set. They had not been in political protest before. They were just coming from the ground up and really upset. And that's why I wanted to study them to understand where this would go and who they were and where it would go. And many people wrote about it in France, about how puzzled they were and how they didn't really know whether this was a repeat of the French Revolution and the Paris Commune, or whether it was a right-wing movement of nationalism, anti-immigrant, you know, sort of, they used to call them jacqueries. That's the negative kind of idea of not organized and very derogatory word kind of for people coming as nationalists and anti anti anti-social welfare and things.
So it sounds like the Yellow Vests are interesting in terms of contemporary protest movements because this isn't reducible to left versus right. And also, it's emerging from very specific circumstances, namely this era of neoliberal austerity, class fragmentation, precarity, and state withdrawal. The state isn't helping, matters at all. How important is that to the formation of the Yellow Vests? And also, do you think part of what makes a difference is that its politics were built through practice more than ideology?
I think the last sentence is crucial. That its politics were built through practice. People did not come as militant activists from either direction. When they came out, they were sort of the right-wing fascist Marine Le Pen kind of adopted them. And then the left wing, the party that was like sort of what we would think as like, Bernie Sanders adopted them as well. So they were supported by different parties, but they refused to acknowledge them. They refused leadership. They were what they call horizontalists. They wouldn't accept leader. So in that
So
way,
they weren't necessarily supporting either Le Pen or Mélenchon.
not at all. They were angry at parties. They were angry at unions. They felt they'd been tricked, cheated, and all their services were being destroyed. And they were just plain angry. But they were very, like you said, they were very, very upset. They said that the government, Macron, was stealing the state. They were the opposite of Trump in January 6th. They weren't talking about the state as a swamp. They were the exact opposite. They say, give us back our state. Give us back our universal entitlements. Rebuild our healthcare system. Rebuild our transportation, our buses, our post offices, our villages. You have just over the last 20 or 30 years, as you said, neoliberal, cut back, privatized, cut back, put us in debt. Our salaries today are hardly worth what they were 50 years ago. And on top of that, we don't have the healthcare we used to have. And we can't make it to the end of the month. And they would meet, they built these cabins in these traffic circles, and they would meet every night and discuss what they had lost and how they couldn't make it, and how their children were not able to get enough food to eat, and how if they were sick, they weren't able to get to the hospital. And it was very universalistic. It was never about, well, those people are getting benefits like you hear in America. They're wasting our state money. It was never about that. It was always about give us back our general government entitlements. And that's why they used the word stealing the state. And young people said that they were losing their futures. Those were the kind of words people used.
Do you see the Yellow Vests as emerging at sort of how do I put this? It sounds like we're in a transitional moment almost. And the Yellow Vests represent this moment where our traditional political categories are maybe breaking down a bit, and we're seeing these new forms of collective action that are being constructed sort of on the go experimentally.
I totally agree that we're in a moment of transition. So the political parties in France that were in power, they are like Macron, who's the president now, was elected by his own party. He keeps changing its name, but he invented it. It was funded by wherever he could get funds. It was not a political party, has no on the ground representation. And then the party of the extreme right, Marine Le Pen, has never been a party. It's bigger now. And Mélenchon is a new party. So we're definitely in a moment when people are throwing out their old parties, throwing out what they used to look for. We're also, though, in a moment where there's a blurring, a very dangerous, I think, blurring of left and right. You know, when you used to have strong unions, and there was a definition of the left which came from France, which meant that it was for the working people, for the poor. It was on the side of equality, of citizens getting benefits. That's what the left meant. And actually, that is what's getting blurred. That's why here in this country, when, you know, Trump talks about the swamp and people think Biden wasn't the Democratic Party no longer stands for those things, although he brought in all kind of infrastructure and stuff. So there's a lot of blurring. And what I read about the 1930s, people like Gramsci, people like Polanyi, you don't need to, I mean, I'm not going to go into theory, but they, especially Gramsci, argued that in the 1930s there's a real blurring of right and left, not because the left is not important, but because the extreme right adopted, like Hitler, National Socialism, socialism for the people, adopted those words and actually attracted people who were really, really upset about inflation and stuff. So this blurring is very dangerous. And I think the yellow vests certainly reflected that. But I think that it's really important to have a definition of left and right. And the definition I use in this book is between inclusive social policies, which everybody is entitled to, your pension, your unemployment insurance, your citizenship, your rights to get citizenship, those things, as opposed to the right, which Marine Le Pen now is saying, even if you're born in France, you can't have citizenship. That's what she wants. And she wants to restrict the healthcare and everything else only to certain groups. And that I call right wing. So I think it's incredibly important to keep pointing out the difference, even when much of the same vocabulary is now being used on the extreme right. And when Marine Le Pen's she's the fascist side, her father was that and said he was. She's changed the wording. But that changing of the wording, which is so well documented by the French, is so crucial and so dangerous. And that's why I think we need to be very clear about left and right.
I agree with that. And, you know, I use the term breaking down, but I like how you put it more. It's ideological blurring. And we see that a lot in the yellow vests. So how do you square that? Because you have people that associate with the yellow vests who may have supported Le Pen in an election or may have supported Mélenchon. So how do they end up working together?
That is what my whole book is about. It's about how they came in with these different ideas. And on the one hand, they didn't argue. You could go to a yellow vest group. As long as I want to say, I did not put on a yellow vest because I'm an anthropologist and I wanted to be clear I wasn't not from France, etc. But if you put on a yellow vest, you're accepted by other. They said it from the start. They didn't ask you your politics. They didn't ask you your address. They didn't ask you how old you were. If you put on a yellow vest, you were a yellow vest. And they took each other's phone numbers and they sent texts and they were followed on Facebook. That's what they used. You were part of them. They would support you down the line. And they would write slogans on the back of the yellow vest so that you could take their picture and get their point of view without ever putting their face on Facebook. So that was important. But they as they hung out together in these cabins, they called them cabanas, and as they came into these demonstrations, which they call wild demonstrations because they refused to follow, they went in the middle of the road and they broke windows, they did everything for performers to get attention. They set motorbikes on fire. When they did these things, they did not say, I'm left or right. They said, we are angry and this is what we want. And so over time, though, over time, no question about it, the whole movement now and the Yellow Vests were joined by many, many left activists and became kind of threads and streams that now go through the environmental movement, that go through the Black Lives Matter movement, that go through the movements for Mélenchon, in fact. So, and the unions. So they became, that's what I followed. Where are they going? What's going to happen? And over time, the first thing they did, they were, because of their wild demonstrations and because Macron never gave them the right to demonstrate, the French have a way of recognizing protesters. If you're recognized, there are certain rights that you have. They were never recognized. So they were immediately attacked by the police with grenades, all kinds of tear gas, etc. And they immediately began to lose eyes. One of the leaders, Jerome Rodriguez, was one of the first to lose an eye within a month. And he was a truck driver. I think I'd have to check, or a plumber, but I think he was a truck driver. And then they lost hands and they lost feet. They were wounded. And these things happened because they were subject to much more police attack than previous demonstrations because they had not been recognized as legitimate protesters. And they saw this as really derogatory on the part of the government. And because of that, they joined the Black Lives Matter movement. And when there was a huge demonstration in 2020 supporting the American Black Lives Matter, but also against the black man who died in police, against the police for a black man who died in police custody earlier on, the Yellow Vests went supportively to those movements. They had never heard of these movements before. They had never cared about these things before. So as things started to happen, the whole energy and pressure went in that direction, and in other ways in which they went in that direction, environment and against the increase in pensions and things like that, increase in the age of pension.
I know I'm going to have at least one or two listeners that'll be saying, well, I heard the Yellow Vests were just, they were fascists and all ultra right wingers. How do you respond to the people that have that conception? And why do you think it's important not to sort of throw out the Yellow Vests? And why do you think there's these conceptions?
When I first started to study the LOS in January 2019, there was a debate, and the debate was between Antonio Negri, who said these guys are spontaneous populists, we have to support them all the way. Of course, they're progressive, and a guy called Etienne Balibar, who was an anthropologist, and saying there's a long history of right-wing movements in France coming from the provinces, and they're very nationalist. They came up against the war, the Algerian independence. They were nationalists. They supported fighting to keep Algeria. They were anti-Semites. They said things like, dirty Arab, dirty Jew in French. So they were really the worst. And it could have been that. That's what and other people were worried about that because running through the streets, who knows? So I wasn't having my mind set when I began. I was worried which way was it going to go. And part of what I did was study the movements of the right, the history of the right in France. And I also studied the media. And what happened was immediately they were criticizing the Macron government. Macron has like no support now, I promise you. He didn't even run his party didn't run in the recent municipal elections. He is so not supported now. But at that time, it was his early 2018, his early first election. And he immediately said they were anti-Semitic. He said the Yellow Vests are anti-Semitic. That's why these things are happening in France. So already he had a huge number of people terrified of the Yellow Vests. This was a right-wing, nationalist, anti-Semitic movement. So I studied that, and I saw that that came from one event that was all over the New York Times, all over the Guardian. And it was this one guy who is the son of Holocaust survivors and has a radio program. And when he walked out of his house, there were calls from Yellowish as he walked into there, where the parade, wasn't parade, wild movement was going by. Somebody yelled out, dirty Zionists, and said, go back to Israel, nasty things in French. And that was caught on a TV and it was spread, and Macron took that up. And so everywhere they were called anti-Semitic. However, there were many, many people in the Yellowish, and in fact, there is no stories of any anti-Semitic attacks by the Yellowish. And one of the ways in which this movement was discredited was with those kind of accusations. And they were also called racist. But as I say, they joined the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think that the Yellow Vests themselves were a real mixture. And over time, they learned like ways of thinking. And I have documented testimonials like that. I have one, I can tell you, from a woman who I met. And she had started out being a supporter of Marine Le Pen, but she said her father had been right-wing, but she was more extreme, and she worked on an assembly line. And she said, well, I was supporting Marine Le Pen. I wanted to be even more extreme than my family. And I didn't know, that's what I was doing. I went to the first roundabout, the first traffic circle in my area. And the people there were singing songs, and I liked them, and I liked the front of the march. And so I joined them. It turned out they were anti-capitalist. I didn't know what that was, she says. But I liked the people, and I hung out with them, and I liked their songs. And she said, nowadays, I've been hanging out with them for 2 or 3 years, and now I'm on the left. I call myself an autonomous. I vote for Mélenchon. And she said, I think the reason, or she said, when I was younger, I was a gay woman. I was a lesbian, but I didn't want to do anything or say anything. And I kept very quiet, and I voted for Marine Le Pen, the most extreme I could, to show how good I was. And now I'm open about my sexuality, and I've joined the leftist movements that I met at that roundabout. So she didn't come in with that idea. That's what I mean. It was a process. I can give you other examples, but that's just one.
Well, I want to get into some of the core concepts, like the terms you use. And one of the ones that comes up in regards to the sort of meetings of different uh, activists with different focuses come together in this. And you call that thresholding. Can you explain that?
I thought that was such a difficult word, but it seems to be the best one. It's a clumsy word, but it claim what a threshold is. Imagine you're American and you have a front door, and then you maybe have a hallway and then another steps down, or you have a space between your front door and the outside, like a foyer or a lobby or a main. It separates, so you keep your door shut, but you can let people in. So the way I understood thresholding was that you have movements, as I've mentioned, like Yellow Vest, and then you have movements like Black Lives Matter. They never join. They never join. But they meet at the threshold. They can join. They're each running in their own direction. But they stop at the threshold and they build a kind of trust and understanding across that foyer. And that is what I call threshold. People talk about convergence. You would love to have convergence, right? The environmental movement joining the Yellow Vest, joining the Black Lives Matter. But you don't often get that. But if you're looking for what I call a historic bloc, you're looking for people who are against the inequality and for social justice together. Thresholding is like joining at that point and sharing some vision. And that is so important. Trust that they meet in the foyer, trust that they meet at the threshold, allows them to see where they might trust each other and what their unified vision might be. So that's why, if you want to build what Gramsci calls a war of perdition, or what I might call a historic bloc to counter what the ideology of the moment is, that's the kind of thing that helps. It's like people meeting at the threshold, in person, at the doorways, across the dividing line, and understanding and trusting each other. Maybe not taking all of those demands, but understanding where they're coming from. And that really, really happened also, not only with Black Lives Matter, but with the environmental movement. And I document that, how that happened. I could talk about that.
I wanted you to talk about that because I think you talk about environmentalists and like working class drivers working together.
Yes,
Yellow
yes. And in
vests.
America, we really need it. Anyway, so what happened was the Yellow Vests, not only were they called anti-Semitic by Macron, but they were also called anti-ecologists very much in the beginning. They were anti-environmentalists, anti-ecologists, because the diesel gas was, the tax on diesel was called by Macron an ecological move. When people did analysis, they found that only 1/4 of that tax was ever going to go for anything ecological. But that was how it was sold to the public. So when the Yellow Vests hated this diesel tax, and came out and campaigned against it, they were immediately called ignorant, really bad words, anti-environmental, and all the world needs to look. We're having climate change, and look what they're doing. So they were seen as the enemy of the need for climate control. And so, and ignorant. They were always called ignorant and
Is
angry.
there
But
sort of an anti-provincialist bigotry?
yes,
Okay.
yes, they were seen as rural and ignorant. Yes. And it was in the New York Times and it was in the Guardian, things that English people could read. Very derogatory. A rage that had no, they didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what climate change was. So anyway, I went to a demonstration in February of 2019, just after they started. And I was interested because it was an environmental demonstration. They had a big red bus, a British bus, and on the top it was painted in rainbow colors, and on the top were all these speakers about ecology. It was right in front of what we call Opera, the big old opera house in a big square, and there were thousands of people there. And the Yellow Vests went to this because they just called their demonstrations wherever they chose. So on a Saturday afternoon, we all went rushing to this bus. And I stood there for about an hour and they're giving ecological speeches. And then, of course, the environmentalists said, time to go. And they all went off in their direction down the road in a nice organized parade with certification and legal rights to walk down the middle of the road in that direction. And the Yellow Vests followed them. And then suddenly, within 500 yards, the Yellow Vests ran off in the other direction in their Yellow Vests, breaking windows and going towards the Arc de Triomphe in a totally different direction. But they had been there in the square where the environmentalists were. And then I went with the Yellow Vests and I followed them all around Paris in all different directions. And then at the end of the day, at around 5 o'clock, I went back to the main central, one of the main central squares called La Place de la République. And I have a photo. I went back there, and there the environmentalists were giving again very, very polemical speeches about the end of the world. And the Yellow Vests had somehow shown up again at La Place de la République. And I took a photo of it with flowers in their hair and stuff. I thought it reminded me of the 60s and the first ecology days. Anyway, so for me, that was what I call thresholding. And after that, the Yellow Vests changed their slogan. They used to say for the end of the month, and they added it. We want to live through the end of the month and the end of the world. Or, they wanted to add the environmental issues onto their slogans, and they had many different ways of doing that. And so after that, the environmental demands were kind of integrated into the Yellow Vest demonstrations with all kinds of slogans. From the end of the world, from the end of the month to the end of the world was one of the main ones.
So a big question that is coming up in my head right now, talking about all of this with you, is I understand the fear that many on the left had of this, because any movement can be hijacked by sort of right-wing entryism, right? Like you said, they often try to take the language of the left and then redirect that into a right-wing program. Why didn't that work with the Yellow Vests? Why, yeah, like you said, there's many of these people involved with the Yellow Vests may have started out right-wing and drifted left-wing. Why is that?
I think it's all about human human contact. It was very much an on the ground human contact every night in the cabanas. They hung out there and they talked to each other and they recognized things that they had never, like poor people or women who couldn't feed their children or people who had disabilities were not treated badly. They were included as yellow vests. And I went to a people's house that was created by the elements. There were people of color, there were transgender people, people that those rural people from the provinces, what we might call old France, had never included in their world before. And they were included. And that was new. So it was like a process where the people who'd been treated, who'd been seen, like lots of people in France, like in this country, are brought up with all kind of prejudices, racism, sexism, you name it, anti-gay, whatever. But as they met together, these things they recognized these people as part of their movement. The other thing I would say is very, very different from the right wing in this country. Like, I think that there is no one populist leader like Trump. The Yellow Vests came from the ground. They were a grassroots movement. Now, the Tea Party in this country, I call it astroturf, and it's been studied by like Theda Skocpol at Harvard, that it was funded by right-wing senators and people like that. And it was definitely built up in a way. So the Tea Party was not a grassroots movement. And the MAGA movement is led by a leader, a cultish leader, who says, that's another kind of thing. It's from the top down. We're talking about from the bottom up, where people met each other and generated their own visions.
Now, one of the other key concepts, and I think we've been circling around it, but I want you to spell it out, is commoning.
Ah, yes. So I grew up in England, In England, they have footpaths, public footpaths, and there was a movement in the 1930s, a commoning movement, which said, we've had these footpaths for hundreds of years, and now these farmers who own land, they think they can stop us. We're going to keep walking across these footpaths. It's not that you can't own your farm and keep your cattle and keep your sheep and have your maize or whatever grows there, but we have the right to walk through. And we are keeping these footpaths open by walking every single Sunday down these footpaths. And that's commoning. It's like maintaining the public good. As lots and lots and lots of English poems, but it's also in France, it's also in the US, this land is my land, Woody Guthrie, this land is your land. And on one side of the sign, it says no trespassing, but if you go to the other, you can walk right through. It doesn't say nothing. It's a common idea in the US as well, that we have public rights you cannot take away. And we do in New York. There's a right to housing. That's something that the homeless people fought for in the 80s. A right to housing. They have that right. People have fought in this country for a right to health. That's what the Obamacare was all about. Those are commoning movements. We can see that there's a collective shared right to these. There's a right to our streets. There's a right to our parks that people recognize. But people have to keep those rights open only by using them. If you don't do commoning, there are people who will take your rights away. The government may, but mostly it's rich people or corporate wealth or whatever, taking away your rights to water, your rights to clean air by pollution, your rights to adequate health by toxic chemicals. I mean, you have those rights. We all recognize it. And commoning is the way you fight for some rights. And it's kind of it's not about property ownership. It's not about private and public in that sense. It's about the rights, collective shared rights within a society and what we recognize and how we maintain them.
I think it's very interesting too. You mentioned the Tea Party. It's very different than the Tea Party movement, because I would say the Tea Party movement was just very anti-state in the US, and it was like a libertarian movement,
That's
It ends
exactly
up
right.
being pro-business, whereas this movement of the Yellow Vests, there's anger at government, which I guess some people would say, oh, that's anti-state, but then there also is a desire for services, welfare, protection by the state.
Exactly. Exactly. It's completely in favor of the state. But they thought Macron, and they still think, that he's stealing the state, that he took out something like 200 billion in to give to corporations, and now that's a debt to the state. And they're furious about that. But it wasn't about what he spends on healthcare, which has been reduced, or what he spends on education, which has all been reduced. So a lot of the people in the yellow vests were teachers and school principals and nurses and doctors and professors, people who knew that their public collective institutions, they don't really have private universities in France, their public collective institutions were being destroyed or cut back.
I wanted to ask as well. I know you didn't want to get too deep into theory, but I did want to
I
talk
don't
about.
mind.
Well, I wanted to talk about two thinkers that I noticed brought up in your book a few times. So you mentioned one already, Antonio Gramsci. You start with that quote. I believe it's something along the lines of the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. This is the interregnum, the time of
That's
monsters
right.
type thing. Yeah,
Exactly. I can't
I'm
remember it, but
paraphrasing
that's it.
poorly here, but I'm curious, why does Gramsci loom so much over this book and this investigation?
You know, for me, he is critical in the way I think about human society, critical, because he includes everything we know about how money is so and property are so decisive and divisive, how economy, whether something's cheaper or expensive is so important to all, or how much you earn. But he goes beyond the workplace. He accepts that the structure of industry is super important. He organized the workers in Turin and Italy. But at the same time, he wrote books about folklore, or books, he wrote segments about folklore. He really respected the popular understandings. And that to me is super important. He wanted to understand what real on the ground people believed and how they changed what they believed in relation to how the society was operating. So to me, that's like absolutely crucial. And the other super important thing about Gramsci and the other guy who I assume you're saying is Karl Polanyi, but those are the two guys I write about. So the thing about Gramsci is he was organizing workers in Turin in like the early 20th century. But by 1930, Mussolini came to power and put him in jail, and he lived the rest of his life in jail. I think he died in jail. And he was very concerned with inequality because he grew up in Sardinia, where people in Sardinia were sort of like black people in this country or immigrants. They were treated very badly. So he's very concerned about the inequality within the popular classes. So that's why he also wanted to understand people's own understandings and rituals and how you bring groups together. So he understood kind of structural inequalities within a population, as well as understanding fascism. And that's what he was writing about. And I actually said that Polanyi and Gramsci were so hopeful in a black period, in a dark era of the 1930s. He died before the Second World War, but he died under Mussolini.
And many
But
feel like
he
we're in a similar moment now. Yeah.
yeah,
Go on,
exactly.
go on.
And Polanyi grew up in Vienna, and his all his writing was against the guy Hayek, who was inventing neoliberalism, the inventor of neoliberalism. Hayek was a professor later on in London. They hired him, and Wien hired his student Milton Friedman at Chicago, and they invented this neoliberal thing. And Polanyi, from the 1930s, had been showing how, as you got more of this kind of fake idea of a market economy, that the corporations were commodifying water, air, land, health. They were selling it all back to people. And so he understood that. And he was Jewish, so he had to flee Vienna in the 1930s. And he went to live in England. And he wrote a book called About the Swing of the Pendulum, which showed that that, yes, things can be extremely fascist, but then there can also be a reaction. And I was interested in his idea that people build, that there comes a reaction to that extreme commodification. And you can see it in the history of Britain. That's what he documented. So he was hopeful. Here he is in exile in the middle of World War II, being hopeful, and Gramsci in jail under Mussolini and hopeful. And I thought, this is what we need.
There was actually another thinker that I was thinking of asking you about, and I know he's not covered as extensively in the book, but you mentioned him a few times, and I was reminded of him immediately when you said that the yellow vests came from the provinces, because he is an academic that came from the provinces. I'm talking about the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and
Oh, yeah.
his influence on the book.
Well, Bourdieu, I do mention Bourdieu right in the preface, actually. And my whole way of doing things kind of comes from what he said. He wrote about how the person, that is me, the author, whatever you, the sociologist, needs to understand themselves and live through how they live through what they're describing. You know, he was an anthropologist, sociologist, but he lived in Algeria first and documented the problems. It was for the Algerian independence, and he documented the situation in Algeria. That was his first book, I think. And he began to emphasize that it's more than class. Class is so important, but that, or the popular classes, but you have to understand, kind of like Gramsci did, you have to understand how people live class. So it has to do with how they describe food. Or, like, for example, you think of France as like connoisseurs, you know, the most famous. People ask me, what are the best restaurants? I never went to one. Honest to God. And the Yellow Vests attacked Le Fouquet, which is the fanciest restaurant on the Champs-Élysées. Because what do they bring to there? They bring white sliced bread, sliced cheese, the old, you know, like we think of Kraft slices, and the cheapest sausages that you can make, because they can't afford, I mean, they may be better cooks than you and I, but they cannot afford the kind of food that you think of as French cooking connoisseur in the restaurants. They never go to restaurants. They always have picnics and barbecues. So, so the image of France as divided by class, by taste, is really obvious among the Yellow Vests. And by the way you dress. And Bourdieu related that kind of, you know, France is the top in fashion. It's the highest level. Most of LVMH, and Bernard Arnault, the head of it, is the most profitable industry in France. So that elegance and class, the kind of food you eat, the clothes you can sell, the shoes you have to buy, the handbags, the accessories, that's what France makes its money, the cent. And that's what Bourdieu would call upper class habitus. It's habitus, it's your surrounding culture. And I'm talking about the Yellow Vests, who were looked down on through all of France because they weren't like that. They came in their clothes that were messy, not dirty, but just blue jeans and not elegant, and sneakers, and nothing about them reflected that what we in America think of French fashion. Nothing. And that French fashion that we think of is an upper class habitus, as Bourdieu would describe it.
So I wanted to talk a little bit. This gets into an issue. It feels like the politics of the yellow vests, it doesn't emerge through like a coherent ideology so much as it does through participation. Like there's this anger and then they participate together. There's this commenting. Do you think this challenges a lot of previous modes of thought that maybe other political ideologies have? Like, you know, there's Marxist vanguardism, there's liberal rational actor models, even traditional forms of populism. I feel like the Yellow Vests sort of challenge those models with this sort of like politics that emerges through participation in a very spontaneous way. Am I on the right track there?
Yes, I believe that, you know, Marxism and theoretical ideas, you know, Gramsci, Polanyi, Bourdieu, are super important because I think that I talk about there being three kinds of commons, and I think that part of joining together in those commons, because in the first commons, I see the political parties, the unions, the institutional kind of things like people who are in hospitals and have their patients, and people who are social workers and work with the people in the street. That's kind of the first commons. The second commons is the people who take over space in the street, the urban street or the country street, but the people who are out there and marching just wild, if you see it with the yellow S, mild, wild marches, whatever, taking over space, taking over occupying buildings. But I think there's also a third commons, which is sharing visions. And I think that if you just left people running through the streets, if they were only doing that, and there was not a scientific and institutionalized base for evaluating ideas, we could all go down the rabbit hole, I mean, I don't think that the second kind of just running through the streets commenting is going to have enough interaction. It needs to be an interaction with that's why it needs to be bodies on the line. It needs to be an interaction with scholarship and science and organized unions, for example, who are able to filter out the kind of what they would call in France, the complotisme, or I forgot what we call it, but that kind of thing, the conspiracy theories. And I think all of us, I studied HIV, and all of us for decades now, and now maybe more with social media, are so vulnerable to conspiracy theories that it's really important. And what I saw was that when people had to stay home under COVID, among the yellow vests themselves, conspiracy theories just were rampant. And that's when you got the anti-vax movement and things like that. And I think when people stay home and just have social media, not meeting each other, not trusting each other, not bodies on the line, not meeting the unions, not
Well,
meeting the
they become
volunteer.
atomized. Yeah.
Yes. And they hear these things and they begin, and it's very, very damaging. So I think there's a lot of things that we really need to keep groups together. That's what's so important. And to answer each other in trusting conversations. That's what thresholds are about. Though Yellow Vests joined all the union demonstrations against the retirement, about raising the retirement age. They were all through those. I don't think the unions would have been as powerful in 80–90% of the French were against the retirement raising age. They were full of Yellow Vests and they knew it.
So it's very interesting to me because I think the slogan, they're stealing the state, that could appeal to like a right-wing populist or a
Yes,
left-wing populist. But what's interesting is I think from what I'm getting from you is that what will push things in the direction of the left-wing populism, or what my friend of the show and recent guest Charles Derber calls positive populism, is movements that have inclusivity. How important is inclusivity?
it's the definition of it. It's the definition of where we need to go. And I use it all through. And I think that the left activists, militant activists, maybe they don't vote, but they all joined, many of them in France abstain, but they all joined the Yellow Vests and they were very, very crucial. So the environmental movement joined the Yellow Vests, and now there's a larger environmental movement which includes the Yellow Vests. So it was super important for the people in those roundabouts and in those marches and in Paris and in Toulouse and in Bordeaux to meet the environmentalists face to face and hear them in the vanguard, in the militant activism that they were doing, hear the way they understood the world. I have documentary where one woman went and she didn't have any politics. She was a secretary, 61 years old. She had a husband and 3 kids. And she went to a roundabout because of the diesel tax. And then she began to notice about the cost of living and the reduction of services. And then she said to her daughter, it was 7 hours, let's drive to Paris to a demonstration. Her daughter, 40 years old, the two of them left the rest of the family and drove to Paris one Saturday. And they got They got stuck in the middle of a demonstration in Place d'Italy with all the militants and all the other yellow vests. And the police were gassing them and they wouldn't let them out. And there were old people and children and people were terrified. And she was terrified. And instead, what she said to me afterwards, she said, she wrote this all down for me. She said, my daughter would never go back. But after that, I was an anti-capitalist. I went back. And after they did that to me, after the police tear gassed me and all of us who were like in our 60s and frightened and terrified, and it was the militants that got us out, that finally found the way through the kettling. Those militants, those left activists, she said, well, they were the ones I respected. So it was interesting how what changed people's minds in a direction and what they learned from being there and hearing people next to them explaining why they were doing what they were doing. Nobody would have known that. And she at home didn't know that.
There's another thread I want to tug upon a little bit here, and we've circled it a little bit. I think in the US we have had for a long time the rural urban divide, and that also exists in France. And I think this also gets into I think there could be a split along with that rural urban divide between ecological politics and sort of working class populism. Because I think a lot of people will try to say, oh, well, ecological politics is more urban and rural working class populations, they clash with that if they're populist. Do you think the two can be reconciled, sort of ecological politics and a rural working class populism?
In France, it's not divided quite like that, in fact. Yeah. And the way there was a big movement in 2023 around the privatization of water because corporations were collecting water and keeping them in reservoirs that were privatized. And there was an environmental movement against that. And that was people I met in the rural areas of France were joining that movement as yellow vests. And it was the rural people. I didn't know about all that. I was pretty urban. And I went out to the south of France and I met these yellow vests and they explained to me. One guy he was retired, many retired people. Had been the head of a hospital. He'd been a hospital administrator very high up, and now he's retired. And he explained to me all about the privatization of water and that these little French villages where the mayors had no money and they had no health care and they were selling the water to corporations because they needed money to keep the roads open. And when they sold that water, it became privatized. But if there were a drought, like in 10 years from now with climate change, the water would go first to the corporations and second to the French villagers so that they then might even be unable to get water to drink. And that kind of thing is what people are talking about in the rural areas in France today. So I learned that completely by going into the provinces. I didn't understand that. I don't know how it works in America. So, we have Veolia, which is a big French water corporation, is here and where I live in New York. I don't really know how it works here.
That's a good clarification though. I appreciate that. Before we close out, I guess this is kind of a pointed question, but the Yellow Vests, I think their high point is from 2018 to 2020. Why now? Why write a book on the Yellow Vests in 2026? People will say, well, people are going to say to me, well, we haven't heard about the Yellow Vests in years. What people will even go as far as to say, well, what did it accomplish? We don't hear about them anymore. What's your response to those folks?
Well, I wanted to put this in the front page of the book, but I didn't know if I should, because in 2024, Macron called a snap election because the Marine Le Pen group had won more places in the European election than Macron's government. They're a European election. So he called a snap election for a national election in France to show that he was still in power. And who won that snap election? Within 3 weeks, the left, calling themselves the New Popular Front, which was a word from the 1930s and the Popular Front in the 1930s, the anti-fascist, New Popular Front, in 3 weeks, they got themselves together. Mélenchon, the communists, the socialists, the Greens, and other parties, they got themselves together and they won the most seats in the National Assembly of any other group. And that, I think, is based on what I call the historical development, the war of position, the way in which a historical bloc has been generated. And the most powerful part of that, as far as I think, was the Yellow Vests, because they were the biggest, the most amazing, the most astonishing group, and they're still in contact. And obviously, they've sprinkled into other groups. And what stopped them in 2020 was the COVID crackdown, and they were very paranoid about that. But they thought that's why Macron called that crackdown. So, but all through the union demonstrations, all through the environmental demonstrations, all through and including the student dems, we get the Yellow Vests now. And that's why I believe that the new Popular Front managed to pull themselves together and win the most seats in the National Assembly. And the reason now, we all knew about the Yellow Vests. What I wanted to know was what happens afterwards. What was like the cascade of social movements, the effect. And that's why I really wanted to follow them over time. What are the consequences? And I was interested. Nobody has ever done in anthropology, as far as I know, an ethnography of the emergence of a historical bloc. And that's how I used the commoning and thresholding to understand. That's a Gramscian term, to develop a discourse that's in opposition to the ruling ideology. And how do you do an ethnography of a historical bloc? And that's why I kept going. I didn't know if it would happen.
If you have a few more minutes, I just had a few more questions. How do you place the Yellow Vests within the larger history of France, whether we're talking about 68 or the Paris Commune in 1871? How do you place them in the longer history?
Well, I did work in Barcelona, and Spain has a great history, which one day I'm bringing out a book on. But France is the center. It was called the center of capital, modernity, the capital of modernity in the 19th century. I don't know, people have heard of David Harvey, but his book is called On France, the Capital of Modernity. And David's in my department, so I'm very influenced by him. But in fact, David was there. We had a seminar in 2003 to develop our ideas of the commons, and his book, The Rebel Cities, came out of that same discussion that we all had at that time. Anyway, so the capital of modernity, it had the French Revolution. It first had the idea, the French demanded popular representation. The British over time, but the French had the French Revolution, terrified the British. And then I see the Paris Commune as the first statement of the call. It was led also by a lot of women, and it was the first call for a welfare state. Those women were asking for, help with their children, also the right to vote, education for everybody. If you look at the demands of the Paris Commune, they are the demands for a welfare state. And it was visionary, 1870. And 20,000 people were killed in the streets. Louise Michel said the streets were running with blood, and the only reason it stopped was because they had to bury the dead before they got the plague. So, the Paris Commune is not a good example of how we would like to live. I'm not recommending it. But as far as I can see, and it was first, women were crucial in it because women need the welfare state, and they're usually looking after the children. And it's very powerful what women demand because it's for next generations. And the welfare state was a demand of the Paris Commune. Marx called it the first urban revolution. Other people have called it other things, but the first working class revolution, the first urban revolution. But for me, it is the power of the welfare state and the vision of the welfare state. And what the Yellow Vests represented to me is the most powerful protest in a country which still has probably the most strongest remnants of a welfare state in Europe, that they are demanding still that they keep it. And that to me is like why they are the model, the banner for where people who want to have the entitlements, the inclusivity of a government that looks after them instead of a government that gives the corporations 20,000 times as much of an income for the heads of corporations than they used to have even 20 years ago. We want our money to come to our population. And we're all in that situation. As David Graeber said, we're all the 99%. It's not about really the middle classes. We're all in that situation that we need education, healthcare, roads, clean air, clean water. And that's what they're demanding in more powerfully than I've seen anywhere else. That's why I wrote the book.
I just had two more questions, and I think I can combine this one. I was wondering if you could talk about, and I don't know how to pronounce, I'm going to botch the pronunciation. I was wondering if you could talk about I think they're called the banlieues.
The banlieue, the
Okay,
suburb.
I wanted to talk about the suburbs, and also maybe that can lead us into a short discussion of, the LFS and police repression.
Oh, that's so exciting and interesting. Yeah. Well, the way that say Mélenchon would talk about it is kind of old France and new France, or the terms I use is like post-colonial. So the banlieue are the surrounding suburbs of the city, but they're kind of like if you look at New Jersey, I don't know if you're, or Los Angeles, the suburbs are where poor people live. They're the further out, or even in the industrial areas where people live outside the gentrified centers. So in France, it's always been that way, that the banlieue is where Edith Piaf, the singer, came from. She was the little bird who came out the working classes, and we all love her. That was the banlieue always in France. They were called the dangerous classes, and the second Napoleon, they call him Napoleon III, the emperor. He built the boulevards to push the dangerous classes out beyond the walls of Paris. So the places where I decided to live when I was doing this work, after a while, was in the banlieue, the outside sections of Paris. And that is the urban periphery. And everybody that studied the LFS said they come from the urban periphery. They do not come from the central cities, because the central cities are too expensive. So they came from the urban periphery of Toulouse. Toulouse is a beautiful city. You would love to go to Toulouse and see all the old cathedrals and the 13th century buildings. I love it. But you have to live outside Toulouse at a normal income. And the same with, Marseille, whatever. So outside. So that's why they're the urban periphery. And that's why I concentrated on the banlieue. But the banlieue where I worked was famous for it's called Saint-Denis, and it's famous for having the highest level of immigrants and the most people of color of anyone in France. And the Yellow Vests were accused of being racist. So I particularly wanted to live in Saint-Denis and understand the interaction with the Yellow Vests and this community. And and there's a debate among the Mélenchon between François Ruffin, who's one of the assembly people, who says that old and new France can work together, and Mélenchon, who kind of emphasizes post-colonialism and doesn't kind of include the poorer districts of Brittany and the rural areas which I studied. And, there's a lot of communists and leftists come from Brittany, very famous, and also a lot of right-wing. The villages have both in France. So you don't want to call them all right-wing. But recently, Marine Le Pen has won a lot of small, tiny villages that have nobody left in them, probably only tourist houses. Anyway, she won them with the fascists. So I wanted to live there. And what I showed in my work, what I found, was that there were lots of Yellow Vest groups made up of, like I've said before, teachers, truckers, nurses, all kind of groups in these areas. And that there were also refugees, there were also immigrants, there were also people who had tents in the middle of the road, tents, people with nowhere to live. There were Roma, and that the Yellow Vests organized a food collective. And during COVID, where you weren't allowed out, they sneaked out. They cooked vegetarian food so that people who were halal could eat it. And they delivered it all up and down to the refugees along the canals. And they had to go at midnight because the police, if they came, would knock, I have photos, they would knock the tents that the refugees had into the Seine or into the canal. So the yellow vests, I said in the book, not that there isn't a lot of racism and this and that, you can find it. I'm not denying that there's a lot of that. But my view was that the yellow vests not only saw the injuries that came against them and then understood the injuries against black and immigrant people, but they all, and the attacks, they began to reevaluate what the police were doing to people and recognizing that. But they also began to work as groups with many of the refugees and beggars and people on the edge of the road that they used to have very negative opinions on. And I saw these kind of thresholding interactions going on in Saint Denis. So that's why I thought it was very important. And I argue that the Yellow Vests in these kind of collectivities might have helped to build a barrier against racism rather than to be the racists themselves, which is what Macron was arguing and many journalists were arguing.
Closing out here, how important was it for you to take a ground level approach? I mean, you did interviews, this is long-term observation that you did, and you don't see that in many analyses of the Yellow Vests. So do you think this gave, I think this book has a certain strength that other investigations into the Yellow Vests don't have, because you're showing the sort of human messiness of it all. Like, it's complicated because people are complicated.
So I love that word. Human messiness of it all is so true. Well, let me give you an example. I think it's crucial. I love to talk to people. I love to be out in the street. This has been an absolutely exciting experience for me, and I had no idea. And I had to learn French en route. I had French when I was a kid, but it was rusty. Anyway, the thing is that, for example, I have very good leftist colleagues who live in France, Americans, or who are not French, but they live in France, speak English. They were reading The Guardian, and in The Guardian it said one day that the Yellow Vests had attacked a hospital and actually gone into the ICUs and destroyed where people would die if you pushed away their ventilators. And the Yellow Vests had rushed in and destroyed it. Well, it turned out that was in The Guardian. I was in the demonstration there. And my friend said to me, "Did you see this?" And I had never seen it. They showed it to me in The Guardian. They said, "How can you be with this group?" They were leftists, very well theoretical Marxists. And I said, "But I was there. I was being chased with tear gas. Everyone was running away. There were people fainting. And they were running into the hospital, maybe, because we were walking past the hospital, to get away from the tear gas." And the administration of France had said, no, they had attacked this hospital. It was all over the news, international TV, everywhere. The Yellow Vests have broken into this hospital. They're destroying it. So the next day, or 2 days later, the Guardian had to retract their article, and the TV had to say that actually they were running away from the tear gas, but nobody noticed. The retractions, they come in a little tiny little piece. We were wrong on day 22 or something. But nobody ever retracted their view of the Yellow Vests as violent fascists who break into hospitals.
Real quick, there was also, I think there were things that just weren't covered about the Yellow Vests. My understanding is there were mass I guess they call them preventative arrests. They were arresting people even before demonstrations were happening.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. If you wore a yellow vest, you were a target for arrest. I was standing there with friends, and one of my friends was wearing a yellow vest, and we were just standing in the Place de la République on a log, because that's how they have these logs. So we were watching, and I was there. Well, I didn't have a yellow vest, and the guy next to me was arrested. We were just standing there.
This is like pre-crime. It's like something out of Minority Report.
He was like 78 years old.
Wow.
And he was taken down into the metro where they were lining up the arrested. This happened all the time. By 2020, it was frightening to wear a yellow vest. And so they identified themselves by singing yellow vest songs. And yellow vest songs went all through all the you'll hear them now through all the demonstrations from. They become kind of like the Woody Guthrie songs, the songs you sing in a demonstration. They were all the demonstration were the songs of the Yellow Vests in all the union everywhere. Because you couldn't wear a yellow vest anymore, you'd be arrested. They arrested people en route. They took their backpacks. I went to the courts and I watched the interviews, the court processes and all that kind of thing.
I know I've kept you long here, so in closing, what do you want my listeners to get out of this conversation? What do you want listeners to get who will read the book? What do you want them to get out of the book?
Well, I wrote the book for my students. I wanted people to understand we're all looking for transformative justice. And there are two things. One is that, yes, you can, that, these things really are important, that you really do need to organize and do something, and it's all different groups. The other thing is the importance of the Popular Front, because I talked about student movements. I talked about the Yellow Vests. I talked about the environmental movement. I talked about the Black Lives Matter. And the thresholding to me is super important because in this country, people think if you're not on this one and you're on that one, if you're a feminist and you're not a gay rights or who the hell knows what, if you're not in the same little image group, it's very hard to cross. And that, I think, is one of our we are dealing with approaching terror, and we have a wide open, I'm allowed to talk, you're allowed to talk, we're all allowed to say, we're all allowed to demonstrate. We might, Minneapolis, they got shot, but still we kept demonstrating. We're all allowed out there. They should not be saying, they should be joining together like the No Kings and the anti-ICE and the environmental. To me, they're fragments, they're groups that make up a popular front, an opposition to a right-wing dictatorship, an extreme right-wing. And I see students writing in, I saw it in the New York Times this weekend, oh, No Kings is nothing. I mean, it's absurd. Who are your friends and who are your enemies? That what they did in France was eventually, and it's very, very difficult, build a popular front. It's very fragile. It's very fragmented. You can hear the same kind of critique across everyone. I document. The union said the Yellow Vests are wild. They don't know where the point of production is, where the power is. The Yellow Vests said the unions are hierarchical. They're ordering us around and we won't do what they say. But they joined each other's movements. They marched together. They had these thresholds. And to me, the United States today is in desperate need of that kind of commoning and thresholding, and we have an open, we're not Iran. They have shot a few people. We are not yet 1930s Italy. And we need to make use of this moment to build that popular movement. That's my view.
I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope everyone will check out the book, The Yellow Vests and the Battle for Democracy. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, You've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.